Hey, Chad, do you want me to start admitting people early if there's like 10 people in the waiting room? Or do you want me to wait?
Whatever you prefer. I'm fine either way.
I don't know. I guess usually I wait.
Yeah,
Okay. I'll wait because I'm still wrapping up. I'm trying to get some people in.
yeah, and I'm sure there's always people coming 1 minute after, 5 minutes after.
Paranormal Minnesota. Yeah, they're totally ghost stories. I'm gonna start letting people in and just let them know that we're gonna be starting in a few minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Oops. Oh. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm starting to admit everybody so that if you have any technical issues, you can try to remedy those. We're going to be starting in just about 3 minutes. Ooh. Again, hi everybody. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes. And then we'll be doing Paranormal Minnesota with Chad Lewis. They're waving. Okay, it's about 6:01. I'll be admitting people as we go on probably, but I want to introduce myself. I'm Carol Christensen. I'm the Legacy Coordinator for Kijigami Regional Library. And we are going to have presenter Chad Lewis talk about Paranormal Minnesota. Chad has visited us last year. He has some great books about the bizarre and strange under his belt, and we are really excited to have him here for another year. I'm going to ask, feel free to enter any questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. And then at the end, we're going to have about a 15-minute question and answer. So I'll be dealing with that. Also, we're going to record the program. So if you don't, and then we're going to broadcast it. We're going to put it on our YouTube site, our YouTube channel. So if you don't want anybody to see your faces, feel free to keep your camera off. And then this program is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. And I'm going to be sending everybody a link to a survey at the end of the program. If you could fill that out, that would be great. That'll keep all sorts of programs in our library system, hopefully for years to come. So I'm going to turn it over to Chad. Thanks, Chad.
Well, hello and welcome, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here tonight. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about Paranormal Minnesota from the safety of wherever you're watching this program from. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. So as of right now, you should see Paranormal Minnesota. So welcome. As you heard, My name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last nearly 30 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampire legends in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, reports of UFOs and alien abductions, really, really weird people, odd places, you name it. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. But what I discovered on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore this evening. Some of the weirdest, scariest, and downright most bizarre cases that Minnesota has to offer. For the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to take a tour across the state. I'll give you the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about some of my research at these places. Heck, I'll even provide you with the directions to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you, whether you're a diehard skeptic or a true believer or somewhere in between, to go to these places on your own and determine for yourself whether or not you believe the legends are true. So with that, let's explore Paranormal Minnesota. First stop, reports of UFOs. Now, according to the media, people only believe UFOs because of Hollywood TV shows like The X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries, movies like Men in Black and Independence Day. But what you'll see here is that people in Minnesota were encountering weird things in the sky long before Mulder and Scully were out there investigating. First stop, Sauk Center. 1984, this truck driving couple left Colorado with a brand new painted rig. They were hauling oil, cooking oil, down to Wisconsin. And as soon as they left, they claimed they were plagued by mysterious balls of light in the sky. No matter how fast they went, the balls of light kept up with them. When they slowed down, so did the lights. By the time they reached Minnesota, they claimed that these lights had transformed into small, prehistoric bird-looking creatures that were now attacking their vehicle. By the time they reached Sauk Center, they pulled into the Truckers Inn rest stop. There, they parked their rig, got out, went inside, screaming about being attacked by UFOs. Of course, this got the attention of the people inside, along with the local sheriff's department and a newspaper reporter. She was the first one on site, and I talked to her, and she said she interviewed the truck drivers who went outside and claimed that these creatures were now in the trees and the forest waiting for them. And when I asked her if she saw anything in the woods, she said she did. She saw something moving in the trees, but she said she wasn't going to go in because at the time she had young children at home and she wasn't going to take the chance that there really was something out there. The sheriff's deputy, who I interviewed long after he retired, he also claimed he believed the truck drivers, but he thought they were on drugs. The weird part was that when people went out to investigate the truck, they noticed that the freshly painted rig had a bunch of pot marks all over it, as though somebody was throwing rocks against it, or maybe birds were attacking it, these prehistoric alien-looking things. Whatever it was, the truck drivers were so terrified, they refused to drive any farther. They parked their rig and they got a hotel room in town. But they claimed that the birds or aliens were attacking them in the hotel room as well. The good news is that they stayed at the hotel. You can still stay there. It's still in town. The only bad part is we don't know what room they actually stayed in. And even if we did, the place has been renovated so many times that it might be a new room. So my advice is when you stay there, every night pick a new room, thereby increasing your chances of being attacked by those aliens. Right down the road in Long Prairie in 1965 happened one of my favorite Minnesota cases. And you'll see why it's my favorite in just a minute. And it happened as a young radio DJ was racing into town for work. He just passed a bend in the road here when he saw in the middle of the road a giant rocket ship looking craft. Thinking that none of his friends were going to believe he had just seen a UFO in the middle of the road, he thought he should run it over so he had proof. And just as he thought that, his vehicle lost power. The engine died, the radio, the lights, and he came to a halt in front of it. Thinking as only a 19-year-old would, he said, I'll just get out and go push it over. Then I'll have proof. As he walked to the front of his car, an opening on the craft appeared, and he said, I'll just wait here and see what happens. And as he waited, he noticed out of the craft came a bunch of little 6-inch oil can looking creatures. They seemed to be doing some maintenance on the underbelly of the craft. He said he couldn't see any cameras or eyes on them, but he got the distinct feeling that they knew he was there. Meanwhile, other people are calling into the local sheriff's department, reporting a UFO in the area. After a few moments, these things went back on the craft, and then the craft shot up out of sight. What I love about this story is that the media, they did not portray it as oil can aliens. They claimed he had seen beer can aliens. Being from Wisconsin, I like to joke that only in Minnesota would you see beer can aliens. But regardless, when he went back to his vehicle and got inside, everything was working properly. Started right up, engine was roaring. He raced down to town and went to the police station. Officers who had already been receiving UFO reports took him serious and decided to escort him back to the site of his sighting. Obviously, the craft was no longer there, but there in the middle of the road, they saw a weird oil-like substance in the middle of the pavement. One officer said it was the weirdest thing he had ever seen in his entire career. And it must have been really weird because they didn't take a photo of it. They didn't take a sample of it. They just said, oh, this is the weirdest thing ever. Let's leave it here and go about our day, which they did. Soon after, the road was repaved. Many believe it was the government's attempt to cover up the sighting, where others I spoke with said the road just needed to be repaired and it was a coincidence. I'll leave it up to you to venture through Long Prairie looking for those beer can aliens. Without a doubt, the most infamous legend is that of the Bigfoot, known throughout the world by many names, including the Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Yowie, the Sasquatch, the abominable snowman. And when most people think of these creatures, they tend to think of the heavily forested western portion of the US, the Pacific Northwest. They don't often think of the Midwest. Yet every year we get dozens and dozens of reports of people seeing these giant biped creatures that they can't explain. One of my favorite cases happened in Willow River, Minnesota, and it happened to this gentleman on your right, Dennis Murphy. Dennis Murphy spent over 50 years researching Bigfoot activity in the Midwest because it was nearly 50 years prior that he had his first encounter. He was on a fishing expedition by himself, driving out on a lonely back road in Willow River, when all of a sudden he glanced over into a nearby field, and on the edge of the field, just barely able to make out, he saw this creature standing on the grass. He said it was your typical Bigfoot sighting, 7 feet tall, had to be 400-500 pounds. But what's interesting is he came to a halt and watched this thing was the fact that it wasn't alone. It had another one with it, a much smaller version, whether it was the female gender of the species or the offspring, I don't know. But Mr. Murphy was so terrified, he tore out of there. Went fishing, tried to forget about it. On his way back, he came back and found that nothing was there. The creatures had gone. He took a cast of their footprint, and you can see how large the footprint that he believed came from the creature. I went out in that area looking for the monster, checking it out. Unfortunately, knock on wood, it was not there when I was scouring the area. But out of all the creatures, I get more reports of Bigfoot sightings than any of the other monsters. But Bigfoot's one thing. This next creature I'm going to talk about is one you might not want to know about. It's certainly one you don't want to say its name, because many cultures believe that merely saying the name of this next thing is enough to put you on its radar. That when you go looking for the weird comes looking for you. Of course, I'm talking about the cannibalistic monster of the north, the Wendigo. Now, fair warning, this is a pretty creepy case. You may want to tune out for the next 5-10 minutes and go watch a Hallmark Christmas movie to cleanse your palate. Because the Wendigo started as a First Nation legend with the people up in Canada, north of Alberta. It was known by many different names and many different spellings. But the fear was only for one, the Wendigo. It was a tall monster, anywhere from 8 feet tall to as large as it wanted to be. Very thin, skeletal, had thin skin wrapped over its tightly bound muscle. Sometimes it was missing its own mouth and lips because in its insatiable hunger for human flesh, it sometimes resorted to chewing its own body. And in northern Minnesota, the Wendigo was thought to be a harbinger of death, a death omen, meaning that if you saw the Wendigo, much like seeing or hearing the banshee, the Irish banshee, it meant you or someone you knew was going to die very shortly. Although it did start in Canada, the Great Lakes region of the US had plenty of Wendigo encounters and sightings, including just east of Bemidji, a place called Lake Wendigo. Here, it's a lake on an island in a lake, which makes it an oddity in itself, featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not as the lake within a lake. Many contend that the island is haunted. There have been several books written about the ghost stories of Star Island. One of the most gruesome tales tells that in the early days, people went out to the island. The women set up base camp along the shoreline, started cooking the food when the men went in to hunt for the game. When the men never returned, the women went to look for them. And when they found them, they were all strung up, skinned, dead in a tree. They immediately left the island, said it was bad medicine, shouldn't be here, vowed that they would never return. When those people did come back, other people looking for those bodies, they were never located. Other people tell tales of finding huge holes in the ice of Lake Wendigo, with giant footprints coming out of the hole, walking to the island, as though the Wendigo, which many believe lives in the lake, came out walking to the island in search of prey. So back in the winter of 2015, I set off on an expedition with my 2 colleagues Kevin Nelson on your left of your screen, and Noah Voss on your right. Now, you can't tell, but that's me there in the middle. The reason you can't tell is it's about 30 degrees below zero with the wind battering us. For several hours, we had to hike over the ice just to get to the island. I'll give you a quick taste of what that was like here. One moment here. There, this should be able to share my sound with you. So hopefully you can hear this on your end, the wind whipping through. Now we're all tethered together in case one of us fell through the ice. The other two may be able to pull the other one out. And finally, after several hours, we made our way to the island. Now, my colleague Noah on your left there, Noah and I decided we were going to spend the expedition in our tent. But my colleague Kevin Nelson on your right, there he is, he wanted more of an adventure, which is odd because he doesn't look like he likes adventure, but he was going to spend the expedition in his hammock out in 30-degree below zero weather. First thing we had to do on the island was to get a fire going, not only for heat, warmth, and light, but we had to keep our tallow hot. Tallow is an animal fat, and one legend tells that you can use hot tallow to kill the Wendigo, that you can pour it down his throat, it will defrost its icy heart, and it will die. Just how you're supposed to pour it down its throat, I don't know, but I had my tallow hot the entire time. And then we made our way to the middle of the lake. As I said, many believe this is where the Wendigo resides. Children have drowned in the lake, and the legend is that the Wendigo will snatch you off the banks of the shoreline and pull you into your watery grave, and you'll spend eternity in the water with the Wendigo. So one night when we had a good base campfire going, Noah and I decided to try to conjure up the Wendigo in the middle of the lake. We started walking and we were filming this. And as we were walking, Noah paused and said, "Our boots are crunching the snow so loud, nobody's going to hear what the heck we're talking about. We have to be very quiet." And as we paused there, something on our left really startled us, really caught our attention. Let's take a look. Hopefully this is coming through on your speakers.
Okay, see, I'm trying to be quiet for...
What is it?
Don't have it. Don't have eyes.
Let's take another look at it here.
Okay, see, I'm trying to be quiet for...
Now, most likely,
What is it?
It was a big bird of prey or an owl or something. We didn't see anything. But I can tell you it got our adrenaline going for the expedition. So much so that my colleague Kevin slept with his axe right next to his hammock there. Unfortunately, the Wendigo did not kill him, so I don't have proof that the Wendigo was there. But if you're going to go there, I recommend you do so in the safety of summer. You'll have a much more pleasant experience, or just check out my newest book on the subject, a little bit safer. But if hunting for cannibal monsters isn't your thing, maybe take a little relaxation. Let me just mute people here. Bear with me one second. Okay, we're back on. You might want to relax and have a nice little spirit at your favorite saloon. Well, in Brainerd, for a lot of people, that's the Last Turn Saloon, a historic building that has a long history of weird oddities taking place. It's here that many people have experienced things moving on their own. Bartenders told me often while closing up, they'll hear somebody call out their name or they'll be tapped on the shoulder, but when they spin around, nobody's there. Guests often see what appears to be somebody walking by them out of the corner of their eye, but when they look, the person simply vanishes into thin air. The old historic telephone booth, which is not working, often rings on its own as though receiving a call from a supernatural caller. Many people love going here with a chance to have some spirits and maybe encounter some spirits as well. Here I am on one of my expeditions at Loch Ness looking for the Loch Ness Monster. I'm the one on the right in the blue without the really cool beard. But little did I know, if I wanted to see sea serpents, I should have stayed in the Midwest. Well, the Mississippi River, that is. Back in the 1800s and early 1900s, people were terrified of the Mississippi River because all the newspapers were claiming there were giant river monsters in the Mississippi. Reports were coming in of these 9-foot long creatures covered in a thick scale-like armor that a bullet could not even pierce. Parents didn't want their children there. It didn't help when they started finding drowned bodies and they started blaming these drownings on man-eating fish up and down the Mississippi. What was happening is they were finding that mostly men, of course, were drowning in the river. And when they pulled their bodies out, they found deep scratch marks or claw marks in their calves and ankles, as though somebody grabbed them, pulled them out, and drowned them in the middle of the river. But then the newspaper said, don't worry, we figured this out. It's safe. You can come back, have a wonderful time on the Mississippi River. It's nothing more than a couple alligator gars swimming around. Well, this is all well and good when you don't know what an alligator gar looks like. But when you see that this is a garfish, it's a little different story. Because if a 10-foot garfish swims up against you, you're going to think it's a sea monster. And in fact, it is. It's just one that we happen to know about. But if you follow the Mississippi River down a little bit, eventually you'll come to Lake Pepin, a lake on the Mississippi River dividing Minnesota and Wisconsin. There, they believe something bigger, much more sinister and deadly, is inhabiting the waters than an alligator gar. The first native people were said to only take their strongest and sturdiest canoes out on the water, because every time they capsized or went under, they blamed it on this hideous monster. Steamboat captains and their crew reported seeing these giant leviathan of the deep in the lake. We have newspaper accounts dating back to the Civil War about something big and monstrous in the lake. Here's one from 1871 talking about it being somewhere between the size of an elephant and a rhinoceros. Eventually, so many people started seeing it that they dubbed it Peppy, the lake monster of Lake Pepin. But don't let these cutesy postcards and t-shirts fool you. Many believe it's a deadly beast. Not only have people seen it, some claim they've captured photographic evidence of it, including this creature, which was said to have a partially submerged 30-foot body attached to a neck, a long neck-like serpent moving through the water. A few years ago, a man was out fishing with his buddy. They saw what appeared to be a log moving upstream against the current. They thought it was odd, so they motored over there and realized it wasn't a log at all. They snapped this photograph of what seemingly shows a long-necked, hump-like creature, much like you might consider the Loch Ness Monster. I myself have been on numerous expeditions to Lake Pepin, most recently living on a houseboat for many days and nights with noted researcher Noah Boss. As you can see, we had all kinds of equipment, underwater cameras, sonar, fishing equipment, nets. We even jumped in using ourselves as bait. But luckily or unluckily, knock on wood, Peppy did not make an appearance. Just a couple years ago, a fisherman sent me this from their sonar. of something large on the bottom of Lake Pepin. But the best part about this story is that the people of Lake City, Minnesota, are so convinced that Pepe is real, or at least convinced that you'll come looking for it, that they are now offering a $50,000 reward for the capture. As of today, nobody has claimed this reward. With the weather we're having this year, you might want to head down south, relax, catch Pepe, and be back Monday, $50,000 the richer. Or head even further south to Pipestone, Minnesota, site of the National Monument. This is a sacred area where Native peoples quarry to get the stone that they use in their ceremonial pipes. They believe it's red literally from the blood of their ancestors. When I first went to Pipestone, I was staying at the nearby downtown hotel, the Calumet Inn, an allegedly haunted place, an old historic building. They believed that the place was haunted by several spirits, including the ghostly apparition of a former lady of the night that worked there and a man who perished in one of the numerous fires. But everywhere we went in town, they said, you need to get out to the old Pipestone Sacred Monument. They believed it was haunted. They claimed that when you were walking the trails, you could hear the beautiful voice of a woman singing. But the origin of this voice, this wailing, was never located. Others saw at first glance what appeared to be a native man dressed in full native regalia, thinking maybe he was someone there paying his respects or part of a ceremony. They would often follow him, only to report that he would disappear right into thin air. But my favorite part of the story gets even better, because many have been out at the sacred monument when all of a sudden they come face to face with something that couldn't be there, something that shouldn't be there. But yet there it is, staring right back at them. What are these people reporting? Well, maybe I better let you just take a look. This creature, usually insert laughter here, is something straight out of folklore, what you would consider a gnome, a troll, a goblin, a fairy, a sprite, the hidden people, the good folk. Straight out of folklore, 3.5 feet tall, pointed ears, pointed cap. Now, when I was over in Ireland, I would walk into a pub and say, where do all the gnomes and fairies hang out? And they'd say, which ones do you want to know about? Try doing that in Minnesota, you'll probably get kicked out of the pub thinking you're already intoxicated. But over there, you see, they believed these things had supernatural powers, that they could take your sight, your hearing, or even your life. And they recommended that when you went looking for these creatures, that you bring an offering with you, something to appease the spirits, whether it's some tobacco, a shiny rock, some treats, something, so they will not curse you and lead you off to their fairy realm, and you'll be fairy led and never return. So when I was staying at the Calumet Inn, I decided to walk out to the monument. It's only just about a mile, a little over a mile. It was a bright sunny day, and I made my way out there. And I looked around and I thought, if little people exist, this looks like a perfect location for them to reside. So I got underneath a tree, sat down and put out my my offering, and I called out for the little people to make themselves known. Nothing happened, but 15 minutes later, as I sat there, something fell out of the tree into my hair, or at least I thought it did, but there was nothing there. 15 minutes later, the same thing happened. Then, even though it was a beautiful, gorgeous afternoon, I had just walked there. As I sat there, I suddenly felt like if I didn't stand up, I was going to fall asleep. Maybe they were trying to fairy lead me to their realm. I don't know. So I stood up and I walked back to the visitor center. Immediately, I was refreshed. I don't know if it was the air conditioning or what, but I started talking to some of the stone carvers there, the cultural ambassadors. And I talked to one woman who had been there 2 decades, her mother more than 30 years. She said oftentimes they would hear where the room where they kept their pipes they're working on rattling, and they'd open up the locked door and see the little people scatter. But she said the most common thing that happened to her and her mother is that they would be working when all of a sudden it felt like a fly landed in their hair. But when they went to shoo it away, nothing was there. They thought it was the little people tugging on their hair in a playful, trickster-like manner. She said, whatever you do, do not call out for the little people because they will make themselves known to you. I didn't have the heart to tell her I was just calling out for the little people. But the idea that these creatures and supernatural beings are dangerous is pretty ubiquitous in the field of the paranormal, including this creature up in the Lake of the Woods area, up in the Crookston area and beyond. It was called the devil moose, and it was said to have body parts like it was something out of Dr. Frankenstein's lab. A huge moose with antlers that are going wider than any known animal, and that it has supernatural powers that if anything were to happen to it, it meant bad things would follow. Of course, at the time, this was considered a real thing. Dozens and dozens of people gathered. On several occasions, they had large posses gathered to hunt the Lake of the Woods area for the devil moose. These were white pioneers that were out hunting it based off of native reports, although the native people thought that if you killed it, bad things would follow. Luckily for the monster and unluckily for the hunters, they never found it. Where did this thing go? Did it migrate? Is it still there? Was it ever there? I don't know. Lots of woods up in that area for you to scour and see for yourself. But as Halloween's fast approaching, many people like a scary movie to get them into the mood and spirit of Halloween and the season. Now, how many of you recognize this multi-Oscar winning movie? Well, if you haven't seen this or the 10,000 sequels they've made of it, the premise is pretty simple. A serial killer who happens to dabble in voodoo is shot by the police. But before he dies, he casts a spell that transfers his soul into a doll named Chucky, and then he comes to life trying to curse and kill anybody who gets in his way. Luckily, these stories only happen in Hollywood, right? Well, Hollywood or Janesville, Minnesota. Here you have the infamous Janesville dollhouse. For decades, people talked about this creepy doll sitting up in the top of the window. No one knew why it was there. Some stated that a family committed murder on their child and their spirit is in the doll. Others say a young girl committed suicide. Her spirit's in the doll, or vice versa. But one thing people agreed upon is the fact that the doll was possessed. People went out of their way to avoid this house because every time they walked by, the doll seemed to come to life and watch them as they walked by. Eventually, it became a tourist draw. Believe it or not, people went there to see if the doll would come to life, whether they walked by or drove by. And the dare was that if you went by and the doll came to life, you'd be cursed with bad luck until the day you died. I've collected hundreds upon hundreds of dares from around the world. I participated in hundreds of them. And the overwhelming majority of them, 99%, are bad things that will happen to you. It's never anything good that if you win the lottery or find true love after doing these dares. It's always negative. So do so at your own risk. But then the owner of the house died. The doll went missing. The people in Janesville were terrified. They thought they'd wake up in the middle of the night and find it in bed with them. But don't worry, they found the doll and they gave it a new home. And it was a perfect home for it. Because where else would you want to put a doll that could kill you? Where else should you put a doll that could end in nothing but curses and misfortune? Well, the only place you'd want to put that doll, of course, is your town's local library, which is exactly where they put it, up in the front window of the library. And they had it there in order for people to come and take a look at. Librarians told me they were amazed at how many people came from out of town to see the creature or the doll. But out of town being the key word, because many parents complained that the doll was so creepy their kids wouldn't go to the library. Eventually, it got to be so much, the librarians had to get rid of it. They gave it back to the man who bought the estate of the home. I spoke with him and he said he wants to put it on display in Janesville, but it's too creepy and scary for anyone to put it on display. Hopefully, eventually they will put it somewhere in town where everybody can enjoy being cursed by this creepy doll. But if you're looking to go to one haunted place in Minnesota, I recommend you head to Jackson to a place called Loon Lake Cemetery. Actually, I recommend you don't go to this place because the locals, they don't call it Loon Lake. They call it Witch Cemetery. The legend goes something like this. Many years ago, a young girl by the name of Mary Jane was practicing witchcraft, the dark arts. So the community, in order to stop her from bringing evil spirits to the village, took an axe, chopped off her head, and dumped her body and the axe in a grave out at the cemetery. And if there's any cemetery that looks like it should be haunted, it's this one. It's in the middle of absolutely nowhere. To get there, you have to walk down about a quarter mile on this makeshift trail. And when you get to the cemetery, you'll see that it's abandoned, neglected, and heavily vandalized. Weird things happen all over the cemetery. Disembodied voices have been seen. Odd noises, apparitions have been spotted as well. But my favorite part is the dare. And the dare is that if you approach the witch's grave and jump over it or walk over it, you'll be cursed with bad luck. Every year I hear from half a dozen people who claim that when they visited, again, they broke up with their significant other, they lost their employment, involved in a car accident, or somebody they knew died. So I had collected so many versions of this legend that when I first went there many years ago, I was excited to try the dare for myself. The only problem is we don't know which grave is the witch's. Nearly half the graves are unmarked. Nobody knows who's buried where. It's in complete disarray. The plat books don't list who's buried. So we don't know where this young Mary Jane was said to have been buried. In fact, some claim there may be 3 witches in the old cemetery. Much for Mary Jane, her gravestone sits down at the local historical society's museum. There they have it on safe display because they were afraid somebody was going to steal it. Of course, Mary Jane allegedly wasn't a witch. She wasn't killed. She actually died of a disease, but that hasn't stopped the story from growing. And now it tells when you go out there, you will be cursed by the spirit of these witches. But since we don't know where they're buried, my advice is to avoid every grave you can in the cemetery so you are not cursed by the witches of Loon Lake Cemetery. But not everyone believes there are witches in the graveyard, which is one of the reasons why the first thing you'll see when you get there is this sign saying no ghosts or witches exist in Loon Lake Cemetery. But you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take their word for it. You can take your own word for it, because right out in front of the entrance to the graveyard is a small self-registering campground where you can spend the night all by yourself. It's so secluded that nobody will bother you while you're there, at least not anyone who's alive, that is. And speaking of places to spend the night, this is the most commonly asked question I receive. Where can I go to spend the night in a haunted house? Well, if you have that macabre sense of adventure, you're in luck. Because in Minnesota, you have all kinds of haunted lodgings, B&Bs, campgrounds, hotels, motels, resorts, and the like. One of my favorites is in Sauk Center, the old Palmer House Hotel, world famous for being the boyhood home of novelist Sinclair Lewis. But it's not Sinclair's ghost that is thought to be haunting the building. It's several others, including a young boy whose ghost is seen on this very staircase going up to the upper floors. Other people, while checking out, complain that they had a wonderful stay, but somebody let their child bounce a ball through the hallway at all times of the night. But when they went to look, no one could be found. Other people have experiences in the bar as well. Bottles fly off the shelves as though thrown by some unseen force. Apparitions fade into thin air. One honeymooning couple was sleeping in their room the middle of summer with the air off, and she awoke in the middle of the night to see a creepy image of a man dressed like the 1920s looking over her from the edge of the bed, the foot of the bed. She immediately woke up her husband. By the time he sprang to life, this man simply vanished. Or go down into the basement. They'll give you tours of their creepy basement. In the dark, people see weird lights shining. They see shadowy figures moving about, and you can sit there in complete darkness for as long as you like. Perhaps the most recognizable home, before I move on, I do want to say that I love the Palmer House because outside of other places where maybe one room's haunted or activity happens in one area, the Palmer House seems to have activity everywhere. Every time I stay there, I collect more stories from people who have had a weird encounter there. But as I said, the most recognizable home in all of Minnesota is in Duluth, the old historic Congan estate, better known as the Glen Sheen Mansion. Here you have a murder mystery right out of the board game Clue. It all began back in 1976 when Elizabeth Congan donated the estate to the University of Minnesota, believing that none of her relatives could afford or maintain the upkeep. But she had it in her contract that she could stay there until the day she died. Little did she know, about a year later, the Grim Reaper would pay a visit. While she was sleeping in her bedroom, she was smothered to death with a pillow, while her nursing assistant was beaten to death on the staircase with a candlestick holder. Immediately, they did not want to talk about the grisly murders. They wanted to open this as a roadside attraction, a tourist destination that you could go and visit. It wasn't helping that the media was calling it the Death House. But even though they wouldn't talk about the story of the grisly murders, people that took the tour often contacted me asking if I had ever heard anything odd about the mansion. When I asked them why, they told me one of two main stories. One, that they'd be on a tour when all of a sudden they'd go into a room and they felt like they couldn't breathe, like they were suffocating. But as soon as they walked out, they were fine. Others would be on the stairs where the nurse met her end, when they felt like they were going to vomit or be ill or throw up. One woman was on a tour in the 1980s. She told me she got sick, sat down, and let the tour go on without her. As she sat there, she saw what she thought was a tour guide dressed in a period costume like a nurse. That is, until the nurse vanished right before her eyes. My favorite story came from some supervisors who told me one day an employee was up on a ladder doing maintenance on the building. Then, out of nowhere, he felt someone or something tug on his foot. Well, he knew no one could have snuck up on him without him feeling it. So he turned around just in time to see a human hand disappear from his leg. He got down off the ladder, went home, and never came back to work. His supervisors told me he was a great employee, but he was too frightened to come back to work. At the time, I didn't know this, but since then, many other people have had a similar sensation of something tugging on their calves and ankles while at the mansion. I've received so many reports that the next time you tour it, instead of counting the number of pineapples in the house, you may want to count the number of ghosts instead. But as I'm getting low on time this evening, I'm going to end on the type of case you haven't heard me talk about, because it's a private home. And a lot of people who live in a house that is thought to be haunted, they don't want it to be known that their house is haunted. The overwhelming majority of people that contact me, they contact me believing that their house is haunted. Some of them think they know why. They smell grandma's perfume on her anniversary or see their grandfather's ghost pass by. Others have no idea who or what may be haunting it. Believe it or not, some people are okay with it. They become accustomed to it. It doesn't bother them. Others would do whatever they can to get rid of this spirit. And I bring this up last for two main reasons. As I said, it's the most common report I receive, but hopefully this case sticks in your memory, because tonight, later, when all of you go to put your head downs on your pillows and you hear the wind rustling outside your window, I want you to ask yourself, is it possible, just maybe, that wasn't the wind howling outside your window? And perhaps you too are living in a haunted house. So with that, I wanted to save the last 10 minutes or so we have for any questions, comments, or stories that any of you might have. If you want more information, my website, Chad Lewis Research, has more than you could ever possibly want or need. But don't let your adventure end here with this program. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Minnesota. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I want to thank the library again. It's very rare you can come to a program like this at no cost. You can check out a wealth of information from the library. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, I can't think of a time in America's history in which the library has played a more important role than it does in today's world. With everything going on with the pandemic, politics, societal issues, the library is the fabric that keeps our communities together, a real treasure for anyone that has them. So to show my appreciation, if you're looking to get any of my books from my website, just type in the coupon code library. You'll save 20% off everything just because the library is so amazing. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to the library. If you have a question, throw it in the chat room or unmute yourself if you like and ask it that way. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to the library, and thank you.
I am gonna turn on my video. Thanks, Chad. There we go. Thanks, Chad. That was great. And we do have a couple of questions. The first question we have is, do you know about any activity on Chase on the Lake? I think that's in
Walker. Yep. Yeah, Chase on the Lake's another awesome place to spend the night. They've had odd experiences. A man's often seen there walking through the hallways and vanishing into thin air, or walking into a wall and vanishing. Many people will go out for the day and enjoy the lake and the surrounding wilderness, only to come back to find things have been rearranged in their room as though moved by some unseen force, but nothing of value is ever found missing. So it's one of those where a lot of people go there for the activity. Back in the early 2000s, when I was writing the Wisconsin Haunted Road Guide, no matter where I went, whether it was a theater, a business, a B&B, a restaurant, they said, don't put us in your book, because if people find out we're haunted, nobody's going to come here. But then they said, go ahead, nobody's going to read your book anyway. And now I get emails from them saying, thanks so much for putting us in the book, because it's supernatural tourism now. People want to go there. I've talked to some hotel operators that are known for being haunted, and they've told me 70 to 80% of the people coming are there because they want the haunted story. And that's been a change over the last couple decades, that it's now seen as fun and exciting rather than keep away and don't come here.
I agree. Hey, we've got a couple more questions about some locations. One, we've got a question about Skinwalker Ranch. And the second location is the 40 Club in Aiken.
Yes, I've gotten some hot water from the 40 Club because they're one of those businesses that don't want to publicize their haunting. So if you go there and talk about the haunting, do not drop my name. You'll be getting me more in hot water. But no, on a serious note, yeah, they think, while people there think that a ghost of a man who lived upstairs and rented a room and died of an overdose, whether accidental or suicide, I don't know, that he haunts the place, among maybe some others, where jukebox would play his favorite song, even when nobody put anything in it. Same thing where people would see shadowy images out of the corner of their eyes, odd sounds, weird things floating on their own as though moved by some unseen force. And again, you wouldn't think of just a tavern in the middle of nowhere as being haunted, but they have a lot of interesting stories. Oh, and Skinwalker Ranch. Yeah. I have not been to the official ranch proper, but I've been to that area in the Utah area, in the surrounding areas where people have had weird things happen. And if you're not familiar with the Skinwalker Ranch, I think there's a television show now about it. There have been several books, several documentaries, all of which the library probably has access to.
Thanks, Chad. Hey, I have a question for you. How did you get started? Like, is this something that you've always been passionate about? Like, were you like a kid running around in the cemeteries at night?
I blame my interest on my home state of Wisconsin, because not only do we have the UFO capital of the world here, we have 3 cities that claim to be the UFO capital of the entire world. Growing up near one of those in Eau Claire, Elmwood was one of those. And in high school, I started going to Elmwood, interviewing people who saw a UFO. And it just happened that I started studying psychology at college the next year. And that's what I was interested in, why some people believe in this stuff and others do not. So I started researching more, talking to people, investigating, ended up doing my master's thesis on students' belief in the paranormal. And it just kind of spiraled from there. But that's what got me started. Unfortunately, or maybe luckily for me, I never had an experience as a kid or a traumatic movie that I watched that got me interested in a lot of these things. Although a lot of fellow researchers can pinpoint that their interest was started when their parents allowed them to watch a movie that was a little scarier than they should have been watching. You know, and I joke about the Hallmark Christmas movies, but when I did a book on the most gruesome hauntings of the Midwest, and these were focusing on cases of serial killers, mob hits, untimely deaths, suicides, accidents, the most horrific stuff out there. And for that year I was working on it, I was plagued by the worst dreams I'd ever had. It got to the point where after a day of working on the book, I would cleanse my palate with a Hallmark movie just because I needed that to balance out all of this dark side of human nature that I was discovering. So I joke about the Hallmark movie, but it's meant in love because I'm a Hallmark addict myself.
A polar opposite.
Yes. And 'tis the season, October's the season when many believe the veil between worlds gets thinner and thinner as we approach All Hallows Eve, and that your chance of glimpsing this other realm is at its best, which I always advise be warned though. That means this other side or whatever it is can glimpse you as well.
So we've just got another minute, but do you have any big plans for Halloween? Are you going to visit any haunted places?
I've been going to the same place for the last 20 some years of Halloween. It's a place near me where a woman was killed back in the 70s, and people have had all sorts of experiences as well. But if any of your watchers are going out trick-or-treating or dressing up, make sure you dress in a scary costume. We don't need any more hot dogs roaming around or provocative nurses, because the whole point of Halloween was to dress up and either blend in with the creatures or to scare them off. So if a vampire comes up to you and sees you as a werewolf and says, I better go to that superhero victim. Yeah, so be scary. I guess it may save your life.
Well, thank you, Chad. This was a really fun night. I learned a lot, of course. And if anyone has any further questions, feel free to give me an email and I can send Chad some correspondence. But I just want to say thank you so much, Chad. This has been a great presentation. Thank you.
Keep an eye out, everyone.